Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, July the 18th. It's entitled, Power Displayed, God's Wisdom and Power are Unfathomable. We are continuing our study in the book of Job, and we're almost through it. So far in the book of Job, in the first couple of chapters, we saw the interchange between God and Satan in heaven. And then over the next several chapters, we saw Job's three friends come and spend time with him, and then each of them spoke and tried to give Job some comfort and encouragement and explanation and all of that, and Job responded to each one of them. So there's been a lot of talking back and forth between Job's three friends and Job, and then in last week's lesson, they got through talking, and another young man, Elihu, gave a very long speech. And so this week we come to chapters 38 through 41, and we're going to see God speak this week and next week. Job will have a couple of replies, but essentially this is where God speaks. And God's address to Job in these chapters that we're looking at today centered on his works in nature. And Warren Wiersbe says, I guess he's counted, he says it consists of 77 questions that God asked Job, and they're interspersed with some divine commentary relating to those questions. And the whole purpose of these questions from God to Job was to make Job realize his own inadequacy, his own inability to meet God as an equal and defend his cause. And as we've studied through Job, one of the things that's been difficult is that most lessons we're covering several chapters, quite a span, and to try to summarize and kind of get a picture of what's happening sometimes has been difficult. I like the way that Brother Wiersbe kind of summed up these chapters, because he says that you can summarize God's address to Job in these four chapters in three questions. First of all, in chapter 38, can you explain my creation? And Job, as we've seen, has been sure that his speeches were filled with wisdom and knowledge, but God's first question kind of put an end to that delusion. Who is this that darkens my counsel with words of knowledge? God asks Job, or words without knowledge. The Living Bible paraphrases it, why are you using your ignorance to deny my providence? So God didn't question Job's integrity or his sincerity, but he questioned Job's ability to explain the ways of God in the world. Most of what Job had said about God was true, but his speeches, at least toward the end, lacked humility, it seems, and he thought he knew a lot about God, and he was pointing in that direction, but he didn't realize how much he didn't know about God. And as Brother Wiersbe says, knowledge of our own ignorance is the first step toward wisdom here. The second question in the last couple of verses in chapter 38 and chapter 39 is, can you oversee my creation? So he says, can you explain my creation? Then can you oversee it? And in that chapter 39, the last few verses in chapter 38 and chapter 39, the Lord brought before Job a whole bunch of animals in the creation. 6 beasts, a lion, goat, deer, wild donkey, wild ox, and horse. 5 birds, raven, ostrich, stork, hawk, and eagle. And as he contemplated these creatures, God asked Job, to answer the question, do you understand how they live and how to take care of them? Well, obviously, Job's reply had to be, no, that's beyond his scope of understanding and capability. As the lesson writer pointed out here, the providence of God is really remarkable. Psalms 104, starting in verse 24, says, O Lord, what a variety of things you have made. In wisdom you've made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the ocean, vast and wide, teeming with life of every kind, both large and small. See the ships sailing along, and Leviathan, which you made to play in the sea. They all depend on you to give them food as they need it. When you supply it, they gather it. You open your hand to feed them, and they are richly satisfied. So in his wisdom and power, God supervises the whole universe, and he makes sure that his creatures are cared for. Psalms 145:16 says, you open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing. So, as Brother Wiersbe says, we humans have a difficult time keeping the machinery of life operating somewhat efficiently, but God runs the whole universe with such precision that we build our scientific laws on his creation. So that brings us up to chapter 40, and that's what we're looking at today. Actually, the first 14 verses is our focal passage, and Brother Wiersbe characterizes that question, covering chapters 40 and 41, as, can you subdue my creation? So the first question dealt with God's power and wisdom in bringing the universe into being. The second dealt with his providential care of the creatures that he had created. And the third here then is going to focus on man's ability to subdue. And God's going to use two, and we're not going to get into them much, but two creatures. He calls them Behemoth and Leviathan. Some see them as hippopotamus and crocodile, and there's other explanations there. But those type animals were not, the people in that day were unable to subdue them. So God uses them as an example here. So let's jump in chapter 40 in the first 5 verses here. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. So here in chapter 40, God addresses Job directly. And verse 40 says, the Lord answered Job. And that Hebrew verb there that's rendered answered signifies a direct response to the accusations that Job has made. You may remember, as we've studied through Job's speeches, that Job from time to time has asserted to his friends that God's not treated him fairly. In Job 9, verse 17, he says, for he attacks me with a storm and repeatedly wounds me without cause. In chapter 19, verse 6, it is God who has wronged me, capturing me in his net. I cry out help, but no one answers me. I protest, but there's no justice. In Job 27, Job continued speaking, I vow by the living God who has taken away my rights, by the Almighty who has embittered my soul. So Job has kind of set himself up here arbitrarily as an accuser of God. And so God's question to him here, in essence, is how could Job assume such a lofty position in the light of who God is? So after God has spoken and talked about the creation and all that he's done and how he provides for it, is Job still ready to make his insinuations and accusations about the nature of God's lordship? It was Job's turn to speak again, but this time there would be no long speeches, no more rage, no more challenging his Creator. Verses 3, 4, and 5, we have Job's response. And we know that Job had previously expressed that he wanted the opportunity to confront God and make his case. He thought he would put God in his place. But as we see, it's God who has put Job in his proper place. In relation to Almighty God, Job rightly described himself as small and insignificant. The translation I read from said, "Behold, I am vile." But the word there really means insignificant. I'm insignificant. Now that he had the audience with God that he had longed for, he regretted his impulsive and prideful words and intentions. And as I read that, I couldn't help but think, that's the world we live in today, with all the opportunities we have to express ourselves like never before in all of history. And how often do we see someone say something impulsively and then they regret it and they want to walk those words back, and once they're spoken, they're out there. So in sum, God challenged Job to explain his credentials, to challenge and correct God, and Job could only acknowledge that he had no standing. And to his credit, Job pledged here that he would keep his mouth shut. Brother Wiersbe on these verses says God presented his case. He gave Job opportunity to present his case, but Job has no case to present. His first words were, "Behold, I am vile," which means I'm insignificant and unworthy. I have no right to debate with God. Job had told his friends to cover their mouths, and others had covered their mouths when Job appeared. But now Job had to put his hand over his mouth lest he say something he shouldn't say. And we see that in the Old Testament. Proverbs 30:32 says, "If you have been a fool by being proud or plotting evil, cover your mouth in shame." So that's what we see Job doing here. As Brother Wiersbe goes ahead to point out, until we are silenced before God, he can't do for us what needs to be done. As long as we defend ourselves, as long as we argue with God, he can't work for us and in us to accomplish his plan through us. I think that's something that's worth our consideration, that as long as we're talking and arguing and defending ourselves, God can't use us like he wants to use us. It's only when we be still and listen that he can. Now, we don't want to leave the wrong impression here. Our lesson writer makes the point, and I think it's correct, that it's not inherently wrong for us to question the Lord as he works in our lives. God is certainly not intimidated when we ask questions of him in a sincere effort to understand him. So when does the questioning become wrong? Well, it's wrong when we become sinfully adamant in demanding that God justify himself to us. And that's what we see with Job. That's what we see happening to him kind of gradually there. We may have questions about the way God rules his world, but we have no justification for demanding the answers for circumstances that we deem inappropriate. Because we deem them inappropriate doesn't mean that they are. As Christians, we must remember that God's creator and we're the creatures. And furthermore, we don't know enough about creation to understand all of God's ways. We must learn to trust him as he works out our purpose in our lives. Verses 6 through 9. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me, that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, or can you thunder with a voice like his? Verse 6, there's reminiscent of chapter 38, verse 1, when the Lord spoke out of the whirlwind, out of the storm. Here he answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he told Job to prepare himself for questions that the Lord had for him. So even though Job has confessed his insignificance, he's pledged to be quiet, God's not done with him. He's ready to launch into a second speech here directed squarely at Job and intended to search Job's heart. So obviously Job hasn't fully learned the lessons that God has for him. So we see the Lord calling on Job for more questions. And the Lord says to Job that he'll question Job and he expects Job to answer. There's a little bit of irony here when you think about it, because Job certainly knew what it felt like to be questioned, because he's been questioned by his friends over and over here, and they've drawn wrong conclusions about his circumstances. Now he's going to be questioned by God, who really does know everything about everything. And so in verse 8, the Lord confronts Job with some critical errors in his speeches. Would you annul my judgment? The New Living Translation said, would you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove that you're right? So Job, in his speeches, he's kind of maligned God's justice by saying that God rules without establishing moral order or social order in the universe. He's several times in his speeches he said, why do the wicked flourish? Why do they prosper? Why don't they see judgment? And Job has also assumed the, I guess we'd call it the prevailing opinion of the day, that viewed suffering in the world as God's punishment for sin. And so in order to proclaim his own innocence, Job has to accuse God of going against that here. And so that's a condemnatory word from Job to the Lord. We've seen throughout the book of Job how Job has agreed that sinners should suffer, but he doesn't feel like that he has merited the degree of suffering that he's experienced. And it seems like in this verse, the Lord is asking Job if he was more interested in defending his innocence or rather than in defending God's justice. It's interesting here that we still don't see God explaining his purpose in allowing Job's suffering. And indeed, we never will. He doesn't explain that. As he questions Job, we can see that his purpose is more to demonstrate that he alone has the power and wisdom to decide what happens in the life of his creatures. In verse 9, he says, have you an arm like God, or can you thunder with a voice like his? Are you as strong as God? The New Living Translation says. So he uses the metaphor here of his arm to emphasize his power. And it's not only the power of the arm of God, but his voice that demonstrates his power. His voice reverberates like thunder, displaying his unmatched power. It's reminiscent of Psalm 29, starting in verse 3. The voice of the Lord echoes above the sea. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty sea. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord splits the mighty cedars. The Lord shatters the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon's mountains skip like a calf. He makes Mount Hermon leap like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord strikes with bolts of lightning. The voice of the Lord makes the barren wilderness quake. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord twists mighty oaks and strips the forest bare. in his temple, everyone shouts glory. So he uses those imageries of his arm and his voice to emphasize his power and his strength. When we don't understand the way God's working in our lives, we have to be careful to avoid viewing God as unjust and unfair. And that's kind of the place that Job got to in his questioning here. It's important for us to note that in this passage, God didn't explain the meaning of Job's suffering. And that's often the way of it. We may never know why we suffer. Often the suffering that we endure is a mystery. And like Job, we must accept the mystery because we fear and trust God. I've said before, it's always kind of interesting to me as I'm studying, sometimes something triggers in my mind and it leads me off in odd directions. Well, as I was right here in this lesson, the song, "We Will Understand It Better By and By," just kind of flashed into my mind, and I wondered if there's a story behind that hymn, because sometimes the story behind the hymn is a pretty powerful message in of itself. So I went looking, and I really like that hymn. We sang it a lot when I was a kid. Trials dark on every hand, and we cannot understand all the ways that God would lead us to that blessed promised land. But he'll guide us with his eye, and we'll follow till we die. We will understand it better by and by. And certainly that's appropriate as we look at the book of Job. But when I got to looking, that song was written by Charles Tindley. And he was born in 1851. He was the son of a slave, and his mother died when he was 4 years old, so he was raised by an aunt. And he had no formal schooling. He taught himself to read and write by the time he was 17 years old. And he attended night school for a time around that time. And because he felt that God had called him to preach, he enrolled in a correspondence course from the Boston School of Theology. And he studied New Testament Greek. He found a Jewish rabbi there in that Philadelphia area that would tutor him in Hebrew. So he studied both Greek and Hebrew. And in 1902, he was 51 years old, he became the pastor of the church there in Philadelphia, where he had served as a janitor for a long time. He was a powerful preacher, and the church grew. In fact, by 1920 or something, it had about 10,000 members, I think. And so he was a powerful preacher, but music was a big part of his life. And it's said that during his preaching, he would often break into song, and allowing the congregation to join him on the chorus. And he composed gospel songs in his mind, and not having the ability to put them on paper, he just stored them in his mind. And sometimes he'd have several songs before he got a chance to put them on paper. Well, where I'm going with this, it's a long way to get to a pretty insignificant point. But anyway, I was really surprised to learn that he wrote a song titled "Leave It There." And when I was a youngster, my dad was the song leader in the church that we attended, and I don't know what prompted him, but I can remember him learning that song. And I can remember him in the living room learning the tune by singing the shaped notes. And then when he got it all down, he introduced it to the church, and we sang that song a lot. And as I looked at the lyrics, I realized they're also pretty appropriate to our study in Job. If the world from you withholds of its silver and its gold, and you have to get along with meager fare, just remember in his word how he feeds the little bird. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. If your body suffers pain and your health you can't regain, and your soul is almost sinking in despair, Jesus knows the pain you feel. He can save and he can heal. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. When your enemies assail and your heart begins to fail, don't forget that God in heaven answers prayer. He will make a way for you and will lead you safely through. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. When your youthful days are gone and old age is stealing on and your body bends beneath the weight of care, He will never leave you then. He'll go with you to the end. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. You see, Job lost his wealth. He lost his health. He had the enemies on all sides, it seemed, there. And yet, as he's fixing to find out, God's sufficient to meet all of those burdens and needs. Okay, verses 10 through 14. Adorn yourself with majesty and splendor. Array yourself with glory and beauty. Disperse the rage of your wrath. Look on everyone who's proud and humble him. Look on everyone who's proud and bring him low. Tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together. Bind their faces in hidden darkness. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. The expositor's commentary on these verses says that they're presented as an aggressive challenge to Job here. Unleash your fury, crush the wicked. Then I myself will admit that your own right hand can save you. But as the expositor's commentary also says, they're not condemnatory, but they're lovingly designed to shake Job's spirit into realizing that God's the only creator, the only Savior there is. And Job needed to learn to rest quietly and trustfully in that truth. So to confirm that truth, God continues to paint this word picture of these awesome creatures, and we'll say a little bit more about them in just a minute here. One of the other commentaries I was reading says the absurdity of Job's defiant criticism of the way the Lord runs the universe is forcefully brought to his attention by God's ironic invitation to become king for a day. And that's kind of what he's inviting Job to do here. Show me all these powers you have, and then you can take my place here. If Job had the power, let him don the royal regalia of God's majestic attributes. Job had criticized God for not doing this well enough. Evil people are spared in times of calamity and are allowed to escape disaster. No one criticizes them openly or pays them back for what they have done. That's Job talking in Job chapter 21, verses 30 and 31. In chapter 24, he says, "Why doesn't the Almighty bring the wicked to judgment? Why must the godly wait for him in vain?" So he's accused God of not doing a very good job of managing that. The distinction between God and humanity started getting blurred in the Garden of Eden with the sin of Adam and Eve. You'll remember that the serpent told Eve when he was questioning her, says, "You won't die," even though God had said that would happen. "You won't die," the serpent replied to the woman. "God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you'll be like God, knowing both good and evil." And so that desire to kind of be like God, to put ourselves in God's place, it may not be overt. We may not even realize we're doing it, but it's a tendency of all of us there to think, I know best. If we just do it my way there. And that's kind of where Job's been in this. I don't understand. You need to do what I think there needs to be done. And so it gets diminished even further anytime we assume that we know God's intent or we rebel against God's will. The rest of chapter 40 and 41, the rest of chapter 40, God uses the behemoth there as an illustration of an animal on land that's powerful and strong. A lot of Bible students think this is referring to a hippopotamus. I've seen others that suggest could be an elephant or something like that, maybe even a dinosaur there. And as one of the commentaries points out, today's big game hunter wouldn't be deterred by the hippo's size and strength. But in that day, with spears and arrows, it was a formidable opponent. And so God reminded Job that he's the creator of both the hippo and man. And yet he made them different. The hippo eats grass, is strong and mighty. Job ate a variety of fine foods and was weak and unable to physically cope with the hippo. The hippo has a powerful body with strong muscles and bones like iron rods, while man's body is, comparatively speaking, weak and easily damaged. So the Lord asked Job rhetorically, can you capture and subdue this great creature? If so, then I'll believe that you have the power and wisdom to judge the world justly. Chapter 41, he moves to the sea creature, the Leviathan there. That's a transliteration of a Hebrew word that means to twist or to writhe, so a serpent. And they used the word to describe the sea monsters in the Mediterranean there in that time frame. Can you capture the Leviathan? Asked the Lord. And if you can, what will you do with it? Well, what would you do with a captured sea monster? You can't make a pet out of him, no matter how agreeable he may seem to be. The merchants won't want to buy him from you. If you try to train him, you'll quit in a hurry. Never try to do it again. So God drew a practical conclusion here. If you can't come to grips with the crocodile, how will you ever be able to stand before me? So the descriptions here of the wild animals and these great beasts here in the end of chapter 40 and chapter 41 reflect the glory and majesty and power of God himself. They are his creation, and he purposefully uses them here to illustrate that he created them, he controls them, and so they reflect, they illustrate his power and strength. So it's not surprising that he begins with harmless creatures like the deer and the birds, and he gradually increases in size until he gets to these monsters here. And so all of this is designed to illustrate to Job that God alone is creator. God alone is able to manage that creation. And Job has no standing in that. I want to close here with Max Lucado's musings on this chapter, these chapters. He says, Job couldn't require God to give answers. Instead, through rhetorical questions, God revealed his power and perfection to Job. Job and his friends needed to decide how they would respond to God. Elihu told Job that God was too powerful to communicate with people. God proved Elihu wrong by speaking to Job. God, why is this happening to me? So God speaks. Out of the thunder he speaks. Out of the sky he speaks. For all of us who would put ditto marks under Job's question and sign our names to it, he speaks. He speaks out of the storm and into the storm, for that's where Job is. That's where God's best heard. God's voice thunders in the room. Elihu sits down, Job sits up, and the two will never be the same again. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Chapter 38, verse 2. Job doesn't respond. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. 38:3. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Verse 4, chapter 38. One question would have been enough for Job, but it isn't enough for God. Who marked off the earth's dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Verses 5 through 7 in chapter 38. Questions rush forth. They pour like sheets of rain out of the clouds. They splatter in the chambers of Job's heart with a wildness and a beauty and a terror that leaves every Job who has ever lived drenched and speechless, watching the Master redefine who is who in the universe. God's questions aren't intended to teach, they're intended to stun. They aren't intended to enlighten, they're intended to awaken. They aren't intended to stir the mind, they're intended to bend the knee. Finally, Job's feeble hand lifts, and God stops long enough for him to respond. I'm unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. Who has a claim against me that I must pay? God declares in the crescendo of the wind. Everything under heaven belongs to me. God couldn't argue. Job couldn't argue, God owes no one anything. No explanations, no excuses, no help. God has no debt, no outstanding balance, no favors to return. God owes no man anything, which makes the fact that he gave us everything even more astounding. Consider your understanding of God. Do you acknowledge God as the Almighty Creator and absolute authority? Can you accept His love and special concern for you? Today, take note of events or insights that remind you of these truths. Tonight, prayerfully reflect on God's greatness. And certainly that rings through in this passage today. Next week, we'll look at chapter 42, and we'll finish up Job there. And Job will speak briefly in the first few verses in chapter 42, and then God will sum up there in the latter part of chapter 42. Come back and join us then. Thank you.